Hello and welcome to the Global Forecast from the Economist Intelligence Unit. I'm Tony McMahon, and as ever I'm joined by Robin Bew. In this edition we're going to be looking back at 2011 and forward to 2012. And we'll also be getting views from the Leadership Council, part of the leadership agency, with regards to their views for the year ahead. But first of all, Robin, let's talk about that spat at the end of the year between David Cameron, the UK Prime Minister, and the European Union. How seriously do you take it? Is it resolvable? What happens next?
We've already seen some efforts to resolve it, that the UK is now going to be involved in the conversations about the new agreement, even though we won't be able to vote on it, although I can see already the next political spat, because in the UK media that's being described as Britain policing the agreement. In Europe they think about it slightly differently. I think really what's going on here is that the UK is becoming slightly isolated within the EU, and what we're seeing politically within the UK is this increasing sense that politicians, other members of the establishment who are anti-Europe and would like to see Britain distance itself much further from the EU, feel emboldened by what's happened. And I suspect over the course of the next couple of years you will see more pressure within the UK political establishment to put forward measures which push Britain further and further away from Europe. Europe, of course, very worried about that. We're seeing particularly Germany trying to reach out and keep the UK on board, because Germany regards in many aspects of economic policy making Britain to be a bit of an ally. But obviously other countries in Europe would be quite happy to see the back of Britain, and France obviously one of them. So my suspicion is that we're in for a much hotter time politically around Britain and EU relations, and certainly we're on this trajectory where I think gradually over time Britain will become a little bit less attached to political thinking within Europe, and we'll probably have to pay some kind of a price towards that, because of course Europe will continue to evolve and develop. Policy decisions will be made, Britain will have less of a voice, and there will be some consequences to the fact that the UK perhaps is not fully at the table.
Now, 2012 is going to be the presidential election in the United States. How do you rate Obama's chances, and what are going to be the key issues, do you think, in that election?
Yeah, we're in a very interesting time when you look at both the Democrats and the Republicans, you can see really good reasons why both of them would lose. Clearly that's not possible. So right now we're saying that probably Obama, but that's a pretty difficult call, because if you look at what's going on for Obama right now, we think it's largely going to be around the economy. The economy is actually pretty awful, so you would normally think, well, he is really going to struggle to pull through here. So you see what's going on with the jobs market, which we suspect is going to get worse, and this sense that America economically is on the wrong track, and he's unable to implement stimulus because of the problems that we see in Congress. So lots of difficulties. Why do we think, therefore, that he will still be running the country come the end of the year? Well, that's because when you look at the Republican campaign, you see terrible, terrible difficulties in them coalescing around a plausible candidate. We're seeing lots and lots of individuals run, perhaps who may be very appealing to some of the Republican base, but really not at all appealing in a general election context. And it's still very unclear how that's going to drop. But at the moment, it looks to us as quite likely that the Republicans to tear themselves apart long before we get to the point where the general population is going to get a vote. So we're still saying Obama, but we have to recognise that the fundamentals for him are pretty poor. And if the Republicans could coalesce around a credible centrist candidate, then they would be in with a good chance. But at the moment, it's difficult to see the Republican Party doing that.
Well, as I said, we're going to be hearing from members of the Leadership Council, and the first one is Lady Barbara Judge. Now, she's a former chair of the UK Atomic Energy Authority and a director of Statoil. Now, this year, 2011, we saw a nuclear incident at the Fukushima power plant in Japan, and Lady Judge talked about the political fallout from that incident.
There are people who think that Fukushima could mean that nuclear is dead. From my own point of view, I don't believe it. I think what's happened with Fukushima is that the countries that wanted to do nuclear will go full steam ahead. And those that didn't want to do nuclear and were just tipping their toes in will pull back. But the one thing you have to realize with respect to nuclear is that it's a political issue, first and foremost. Just look at Germany. Germany did an absolute U-turn because the Green Party was so strong and threatened Mrs. Merkel. And she knew perfectly well that the country needed nuclear in order to deal with the changes in climate that they were thinking about. But now what's happened? Now they're burning 10% more coal. They're buying gas from Russia. They're buying nuclear energy from France. The cost of electricity in Germany's gone up 10%, and that means the price of goods will go up 10%. And Mrs. Merkel knows that. But remember, nuclear is a political issue. The other place that you look at it is in Spain. In Spain, where I was a couple of years ago arguing that they should take one of their Basque nuclear plants and extend the life for 10 years, they chickened out, and they did it for 3 years. Now there's a new government. They understand that nuclear is really necessary, notwithstanding all the wind and sun that they were trying to develop in Spain. So nuclear is back on the agenda, totally political. But what's really most interesting is that there's a polarization of the world. Basically, Asia is going full steam ahead. China, India, Vietnam, Russia, to the extent Turkey, and in Europe we have the UK, actually, and France is building, and Finland is building. Those countries that were going to do nuclear are going to do it. They'll look at Fukushima, they'll learn the lessons, they'll enhance the safety, but they'll just go forward. The countries, as I said before, that were hesitant, they'll use Fukushima as a gotcha moment. We always told you. But those countries really weren't there, and they have a big political issue. So from my point of view, most of the world will continue on the path to nuclear because, frankly, you cannot confront the energy challenges that we're all going to face in the next decade, certainly in the next year, unless you have everything. You still need oil, you still need gas, you still need coal, you need renewables, but goodness sakes, you also need nuclear.
So, Robin, what would you say about that analysis?
Well, I actually broadly agree with it, that the countries which were politically quite shaky around nuclear power are going to back away, and we're seeing that pretty clearly. She mentioned Germany. I think it's very obvious what's going on there. Countries which were broadly in favour, I suspect, will press ahead, albeit with greater safeguards. I think if you look at, in the long term, at the energy mix for a lot of the countries that she was talking about and others around the world, there are a couple of really important issues to keep in mind. The first one is that energy security is going to become a bigger and bigger issue in Europe, but actually elsewhere as well. Nuclear provides a significant alternative energy source for countries which are worried about energy security, and I think that's particularly important in Europe. It's difficult to see how Germany, increasing their reliance on Russia not necessarily viewed as a reliable source of energy. I think in the UK you're going to see quite a different stance with more nuclear as a desire to increase energy security. You look at other countries around the world, similar sorts of issues, that they're worried about supply, instability in the Middle East. Nuclear is a solution there. And in terms of climate change, to the extent that countries do start to coalesce around a strategy of really reining in carbon emissions, nuclear has to be part of that solution, because actually a lot of the other alternatives that people talk about wind and solar, simply at the moment technology doesn't allow sufficient generation capacity through those sorts of technologies to really make much of a dent in terms of global energy demand. So nuclear has to be a part of the solution there, and for countries which are seriously concerned about climate change, nuclear has to be part of the solution, because if you're not going to do that, if you look at the increase in energy demand, which is just going to be driven by the development of the emerging markets, if you're not going to go down the nuclear road, you're likely to see a lot more coal being used. As a result of that, you're going to see carbon emissions actually rise rather than fall. And so I think for lots of pretty good fundamental reasons, what happened in Japan cannot be the end of the nuclear industry, but in countries which were already flaky about nuclear before this started, this is a great excuse for them to back away.
Well, now our second voice from the Leadership Council is Sanjeev Nikore from HCL Technologies, and he believes that India faces a very challenging year ahead.
India is big and resilient. It showed in 2008 that it doesn't easily catch a cold. But if you look at India's economy today, it is about to catch a cold. The GDP growth rate has slowed down to 7% from 9% per annum. India badly needs FDI. There is a lot of foreign capital flight out of India. The stock market has reacted negatively. The rupee has reacted negatively. The government is acutely aware that India cannot survive without being interconnected to the global world. And therefore, the government is trying to open the Indian economy even further, encourage foreign investment. There are a lot of counter pressures inside India, but I think India will go along that path. I'm pretty confident of that. The import intensity in India, again, is very high. There is a lot of dependence on oil from outside. So the Indian economy must open more and more for it to continue to be resilient and regain its GDP growth rate.
So a very sobering view of India there. What would you have to say about that?
Well, they've had a great run, have been growing very quickly for a long time, but it's really clear in the latest data that the steam is really coming out of that economy very quickly. Clearly, they're being affected by global trends. The service sector is shrinking. A lot of that is to do with what's going on in the external economy. We're now seeing the industrial sector start to shrink as well. So kind of economies, really, the brakes have come on very sharply. But if you look at India, all of the domestic, the really sort of fundamental problems which have been there all along are starting to act as much more significant barrier to economic growth. So the corruption, which is making it so hard for so many industries to move forwards, the bureaucracy, which is making it really, really difficult for local firms and particularly foreign firms to succeed in the market. Most recently, of course, we had the debacle about retail firms being allowed to enter India and then that removed from them, so they're no longer able to do that. So a real sense that in terms of business decision making at the political level, there's lots and lots of barriers to success. Now, when there are other fundamentals driving the other direction, they have good harvests or the global economy is lifting all boats, India does well. But what we're seeing is that you remove the prop of that strong global economy and some of those fundamental problems within India start to come to the fore. Now, that doesn't mean we think India's going to shrink next year or anything like that, but the 9% GDP growth that perhaps everyone was coming used to, that doesn't look like it's going to be repeated next year. And I think some of these more important structural problems, particularly the corruption issue, are going to be weighed very heavily on demand there next year.
Well, now Simon Davies from Linklaters joined me here in the studio earlier on, and he spoke about an issue that he feels very strongly about in 2012. As the managing partner of a global law firm like Linklaters, are you finding that a more unstable environment is giving rise to more litigation?
Absolutely. We've seen a great deal more litigation of late, and I would expect that to continue through 2012. An unstable environment gives rise to disputes. So we'll see more straightforward High Court litigation. But in addition to that, I think as we see more business activity in emerging markets, and we will see more arbitration. It tends to be the case in these markets that the rule of law is not as developed as mature markets, and people decide to arbitrate matters. So overall, as we go through into 2012, I see more disputes arising.
And there's definitely increased political pressure for more regulation post the credit crunch. How is that impacting the legal sector?
Well, again, there's been an awful lot more regulation coming through. I expect that to build further next year. It's giving rise to a great deal of work to support particularly our financial institution clients. And that is a mixture of new capital work arising out of Basel III, new compliance work, but also as regulators strengthen their position vis-à-vis market participants, we're seeing more regulatory enforcement work and investigation work. Again, 2012 is likely to bring more of that.
I mean, the bad news flow obviously benefits the law firm short term, but longer term, you need your clients to grow.
The growth of our clients is critical to our own growth. And where I see that arising principally during 2012 is our own clients in mature markets moving into emerging markets, and indeed new clients arising in those markets who then go outbound, whether it's from China, India or elsewhere.
And what do you see as the key growth areas? You're talking about the emerging markets, the key growth areas for a firm like Linklaters in the years ahead?
Well, for the reasons that you've given, litigation is going to be a significant growth area, but also I see cross-border M&A and capital market flows. As these move more into emerging markets, we will see an increase there in terms of the South-South trade flows. So whether it be Brazil to China, Middle East into Africa, or indeed China into almost everywhere, Canada or Australia, Africa, those are the areas which will drive the growth in our business.
Well, undoubtedly the event that 2011 will be remembered for is what we've come to call the Arab Spring. Now, it started out, I suppose, we saw it as a liberal secularist uprising. We commented on the fact that Al-Qaeda and the more radical wing of political Islamism doesn't seem to be involved in the uprising. But at the end of the year, we are seeing Islamist parties doing very well at the ballot box in Tunisia and Egypt. How do you think the business community should be reacting to the results of those elections and what's likely to pan out going forward in that region?
Well, I think it's important to recognise that still, even now, there's no role for Al-Qaeda in what's been going on within the Middle East, and a sense that that kind of fundamentalism has been pretty comprehensively rejected. So that's very good news. But it is pretty clear as well that the secular parties that perhaps people thought were going to come to the fore in these countries, that doesn't appear to be what's happening. Certainly in Tunisia, we now have an Islamist government. In Egypt, it looks like that's probably the direction we're going to go as well. Far too early to say what's going to happen in Libya, but I think it's pretty clear there'll be some kind of Islamist regime operating there too. What does it mean for the business community? Well, I think it is really important to remember that Islamist does not necessarily mean not good for business. And if you look at the Turkish economy, certainly at the EIU, that's one of the countries where we get the most queries from our clients who regard it as a fantastic business opportunity and has a mildly Islamist government, but yet combines that with democracy and a pretty forward-thinking business environment in many areas, although clearly there are problems. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the business story is greatly damaged within these countries, and certainly some sense of kind of political stability and a more orderly transfer of power over the next few years. Those things are good for business. But of course, it's far too early to say how it's going to play. In fact, it's far too early to say whether even democracy in these countries is going to actually become entrenched. We've seen an election in Tunisia, we have an election coming up in Egypt, but yet it's actually very unclear whether that's going to be the start of a prolonged liberalisation process or not. So you can hope for the best right now, and I think that is the right thing to do. But it's too early to say that these countries are going to become liberal for business. And in fact, some of the comments that you see politicians making right now suggest that that may not be the case. And interestingly, some comments that we've seen recently about where the Egyptian tourism sector might develop in ways that perhaps aren't going to be particularly appealing to Western tourists. Those sorts of things, obviously, they've been pushed to the sidelines very quickly in a sense that that's not the way that many other people in Egypt want to go. But nonetheless, I think there's still everything to play for. Islamist governments certainly can be compatible with a good and forward-thinking liberal investment environment, but equally they cannot be, and it's far too early to say which way these countries are going to go.
Well, thank you, Robin. Quite a year then we've had, and 2012 promises to be even more exciting. So join us again for more expert analysis in January. Until then, thank you and goodbye.